For over a century, from the late 18th to the early 20th century, the steam engine and the coal mining industry were the twin pillars of capitalism's miraculous growth and the first two industrial revolutions. But the invention of the internal combustion engine in the late 19th century, and especially the diesel engine, dethroned the king of coal. It elevated petroleum and its derivatives like diesel, gasoline, and fuel oil to a position of absolute dominance among all fuel sources. Although discovered thousands of years before the Common Era and first extracted on an industrial scale in the mid-19th century, oil was initially used in relatively limited ways, primarily in mechanics, medicine, and lighting. It was until the early 20th century that the commercialization of the diesel engine and the demand for military hardware to serve the Great Wars dramatically accelerated the scale of oil extraction. This transformed oil into the world's most critical commodity. Indeed, those gushers of black gold helped make a man named John D. Rockefeller the world's first billionaire in 1916. It not only made Rockefeller the wealthiest man in modern history, with a fortune estimated at around $336 billion in 2016 dollars, but it also influenced nearly every major geopolitical event of the 20th and early 21st centuries. So, how did petroleum, often called black gold, become so profoundly important? Tonight's story, inspired by an original article from the writer Wickway, will bring us the answer. A quick note for our listeners. This story is an expanded and more detailed version of a topic we've touched on before. We wanted to revisit it, to do it justice, and to provide the most complete and thoughtful narrative we could. We want to offer a comprehensive look at the history of the world's most valuable energy source. The inspiration for this narrative comes from an idea explored by author Ao Asenzu in his piece, How Oil Came to Control the World. Welcome to Thanh Labs, where we transform dry, complex financial stories into soothing sleep experiences, using sleep psychology and sound therapy to help you drift into deep, effortless rest. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share this video. It really means a lot, keeps me going on this journey. Sleep deep, learn passively, and wake up wealthier. Part 1. The strategic military resource at the dawn of the 20th century. The world's oceans were dominated by warships powered by steam. These behemoths were formidable, but they were tethered to a technology that was about to be surpassed. The internal combustion engine, by comparison, offered double the thermal efficiency. This simple fact had profound implications. It meant engine rooms could be smaller, which in turn meant ships could be smaller, faster, and could travel twice as far on the same amount of fuel. Their operational range was dramatically extended. Despite these clear advantages, only two naval powers were truly paying attention and seriously considering upgrading their fleets. The United States and Great Britain. By 1912, tensions in Europe were escalating to a fever pitch. War was no longer a distant possibility. It was a looming certainty. In this charged atmosphere, the British First Lord of the Admiralty, a man named Winston Churchill, made a monumental and strategic decision. He decreed that the entire British Royal Navy would convert its warships from coal to internal combustion engines. This was an incredibly bold, almost reckless move. Great Britain was an empire built on coal. It had vast domestic reserves and a global network of coaling stations. But it had virtually no domestic oil. Churchill was betting the security of the British Empire on a foreign resource. The battlefield soon proved Churchill's foresight to be unerringly accurate. On the surface of the sea, British warships, now faster and more agile, held an almost absolute advantage over their coal-powered German counterparts. But beneath the waves, it was a different story. The Germans had not ignored the internal combustion engine. They had simply focused its power on a different kind of weapon: the submarine. Germany's early U-boats, powered by diesel engines, inflicted immense pain on the British. They turned the shipping lanes into hunting grounds, and supply ships carrying food and essential goods became easy prey. The U-boat blockade nearly starved Britain into submission, demonstrating in the most brutal way imaginable that control of the seas and the fuel that powered its vessels was a matter of national survival. The First World War is often remembered as a war of trenches. Two sides dug into vast, complex networks of ditches separated by a no-man's land of barbed wire and minefields, waiting for the other to attack. These were bloody, grueling wars of attrition, where progress was measured in inches and human life was expended on a horrific scale. The front lines barely moved for years, and victory often depended simply on which side could endure the longest. However, in the final stages of the war, a new machine appeared on the battlefield. And though it was crude and unreliable, it spelled the end for trench warfare. This machine was the tank. Mechanized warfare was born, and from that moment on, tanks and other armored vehicles evolved at a dizzying pace, quickly becoming the undisputed kings of ground combat. Each of these new steel beasts was incredibly thirsty. A single tank consumed between 80 to 130 gallons of fuel. This new form of warfare created an insatiable demand for oil. By the time the Second World War erupted, oil had become a central pillar of military strategy. In the early years, the United States remained on the sidelines, maintaining a stance of cautious neutrality. This changed abruptly after the Japanese military launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The direct cause leading to this attack was an American oil embargo. The U.S. had cut off oil and trade with Japan, and the Japanese Empire feared that the US Navy would sever the sea lanes connecting Japan to the Dutch East Indies, a region rich with oil wells. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a desperate gamble to secure access to fuel. On the European front, during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the oil fields of Baku in the Caucasus were one of the primary objectives of the Nazi war machine. Hitler launched Operation Edelweiss, part of the larger Caucasus campaign, with the explicit goal of capturing this vital resource. The importance of these oil fields was so paramount that even when the battle for Stalingrad reached its horrifying climax, Hitler refused to redeploy troops from the Caucasus, which was 450 miles away. He famously declared, "If I do not get the oil of Baku, then I must end this war." In the end, as we know, Nazi Germany lost both the Battle of Stalingrad and the campaign in the Caucasus. They failed to capture the oil, and just as Hitler had predicted, they lost the war. It is no exaggeration to say that oil fundamentally changed the face of warfare and the arms industry. As a fuel that played a crucial role on the battlefield, it made warring nations dependent on supply sources thousands of miles away, before oil rose to become the #1 strategic commodity. The arid Middle East was a relatively quiet region, playing a minor role on the world's geopolitical stage. But once geological surveys revealed that beneath the vast, empty deserts lay billions upon billions of barrels of oil, counting for 60% of the world's total reserves, everything changed. The land of Bedouins, camels, suddenly became a strategic region of immense importance. Oil laid the foundation for the opulent wealth we see in the Middle East today. But it also became the root cause of countless international tensions and conflicts that have plagued the region ever since. Part 2: OPEC and the 1973 oil crisis after the Second World War. The world was divided into two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War had begun. While the Soviet Union possessed vast and abundant oil fields across its territory, America's domestic reserves were severely depleted after the war effort. Tensions mounted over control of this strategic resource. This led the Central Intelligence Agency, under presidents from Eisenhower to Kennedy, to prepare a top-secret plan known as the Oil Denial Policy. According to this plan, if the Soviet Union were to gain influence in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, or the other Gulf states, the United States and Great Britain would immediately dispatch heavy bombers to completely destroy the oil wells in those areas. The policy was simple: if we can't have the oil, no one can. Aware of their newfound importance, 4 of the Arab nations with the largest oil reserves, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait, along with Venezuela, took a historic step. In 1960, in Baghdad, they formed the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Its stated goals were to protect the interests of oil-exporting nations and to enhance their standing on the international stage. In its first decade, OPEC continuously expanded, and by the early 1970s, its members controlled more than half of the world's total oil production. The first profound impact of OPEC on the world stage came during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. A coalition of Arab states, led by Egypt and Syria, launched a surprise attack on Israel. In a show of solidarity with the Arab coalition, OPEC made a decision that would send shockwaves across the globe. They imposed an oil embargo on countries that supported Israel, including the United States and several of its allies. The economies of these nations were immediately and severely affected. Their primary source of oil was cut off. Transportation ground to a halt. The price of oil quadrupled, skyrocketing from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel. The industry hit hardest was the automotive sector, especially in the United States. The golden age of the American muscle car, those magnificent, oversized, high-speed, and notoriously fuel-guzzling machines came to an abrupt and unceremonious end. In its place, a new kind of car emerged, one built on a philosophy of durability and fuel efficiency: the Japanese automobile. Japanese cars began to dominate the American and international markets. Toyota, once a manufacturer primarily for the domestic market, saw its total revenue more than triple in the decade following the 1973 crisis. Today, it stands as one of the world's leading car manufacturers. The 1973 oil crisis also fundamentally changed the perception of many nations regarding their dependence on fossil fuels. For the first time, the international community became acutely aware of the importance of energy conservation. Nuclear energy development was scaled up, particularly in countries like France and Japan. Investing in and researching renewable and clean fuels officially became a promising global trend. Part 3. America's dependence on oil, having learned a painful lesson from the 1973 oil crisis. The United States recognized the clear strategic importance of the Middle East. It began a concerted effort to turn the major Arab nations into close allies. In June 1974, President Richard Nixon signed a landmark agreement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This agreement standardized the price of oil in US dollars, creating what would come to be known as the petrodollar system. Under this agreement, all oil extracted in Saudi Arabia would be sold on the market exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, supplying weapons and equipment to its army and guaranteeing its security against threats, particularly from Israel. Saudi Arabia became OPEC's largest oil exporter, and its most influential voice. It was therefore no surprise that by 1975, all oil sold by OPEC was priced in US dollars. This meant that any country wishing to buy oil from OPEC first had to buy US dollars. The value of oil thus reinforced the dollar's position as the world's premier reserve currency. Increasing liquidity in US financial markets and keeping domestic interest rates low. However, tying oil so tightly to the US dollar also made the American economy increasingly dependent on oil. This dependence was starkly exposed when the Iranian Revolution erupted in 1979. This revolution is considered one of the three most important in modern history after the French and Russian revolutions. Overthrew the monarchy in Iran and severely disrupted the country's oil production. At the time, Iran was OPEC's second largest oil exporter. Although other OPEC members increased their production to compensate, widespread panic and fear caused the price of oil to nearly triple. This triggered a 30-month-long recession in the United States. On the international stage, however, this second oil crisis did not have consequences as severe as the first. Many nations had learned from the 1973 crisis and had already begun developing alternative energy sources. France and Japan, for example, had built large-scale nuclear power facilities to reduce their reliance on oil. Additionally, the sharp rise in oil prices created opportunities for non-OPEC countries to enter the market, including Mexico, China, and Brazil. As the situation in the Middle East gradually stabilized and oil production recovered, the market was flooded with a surplus of oil. The price plummeted from a high of $35 a barrel in 1981 to less than $10 a barrel in 1986, marking a major reversal in the global energy cycle. By this point, the US economy had become so heavily dependent on oil production in the Middle East that it could no longer tolerate any political instability that threatened to send prices soaring again. In 1990, when Iraq accused Kuwait of slung drilling into Iraqi oil fields and subsequently invaded the country, the United States immediately sent troops to intervene. The Gulf War ended with the defeat of Saddam Hussein, and afterward, the US left nearly 250,000 troops stationed in the Middle East. To put this in perspective, in 1989, there were fewer than 700 US military personnel deployed in the region. The new American stance was articulated clearly by President Jimmy Carter in his 1980 State of the Union address, a policy that would become known as the Carter Doctrine. Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America. And such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. Furthermore, many people believe that one of the underlying reasons for the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 was Saddam Hussein's attempt to sell oil in euros instead of dollars. And it is interesting to note that recently, China, the world's largest crude oil importer, announced it would purchase crude oil using the Chinese yuan, continuing to challenge the supremacy of the US dollar. In the early years of the 21st century, oil prices once again skyrocketed due to surging global energy demand, especially from China, as the economy of this nation of 1 billion people rose with incredible force. In this environment, an old power, Russia, with the world's 8th largest oil reserves, did not miss its opportunity. Russia quickly surpassed Saudi Arabia to become the world's largest oil producer, accounting for about 13% of total global output. The abundant flow of money from oil helped Russia make a strong comeback after the stagnant post-Soviet period and gradually restore its status as a global superpower. The return of Russia, the rise of China, and an uncomfortable dependence on OPEC. Oil, the world began to see more and more concerns about the decline of American power on the international stage. But then, America's dependence on the Middle East was altered by an unexpected factor: technology. The United States has never lacked for shrewd capitalists and cutting-edge technology. They were not going to sit idly by and watch their position be undermined. This was when shale oil, or unconventional oil, rose to challenge conventional oil. Part 4: Shale oil and new extraction technology. Oil is formed from the remains of ancient organisms, buried and mixed with sediment and other materials, creating layers of organic-rich mud. Over millions of years, these layers of organic mud are compressed under accumulating layers of sediment, creating an environment of high pressure and high temperature. This process breaks down the organic matter, creating oil and gas. If there are empty, low-pressure spaces within the Earth's crust, the oil and gas will migrate into them, forming huge pockets of crude oil and natural gas. These pockets are called conventional reservoirs and are extracted using traditional drilling technology. However, if the oil and gas cannot find these low-pressure pockets to accumulate in, they will seep into and become trapped within layers of shale rock. This is called shale oil. Shale oil was discovered around the same time as conventional oil. But because it is dispersed deep within the earth and not concentrated in large pockets, extracting it proved to be inefficient with the scientific and technological capabilities of the 20th century. Starting from the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the price of oil began a period of continuous increase, putting significant pressure on the United States. In this context, two old but new drilling technologies helped America solve its dependency problem: hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, and horizontal drilling. They're called old, because they had been in use since the mid-20th century. But it was only when they were applied to shale oil extraction that they truly created a revolution. Shale oil extraction became much more efficient. The initial investment cost was significantly lower, only a few $1,000,000 for a shale well, which could turn a profit almost immediately, which required hundreds of millions of dollars and had an extraction timeline of over 20 years. It's not hard to understand why a flood of private companies jumped into the game. The United States suddenly held a key that unlocked the door to vast shale oil reserves in places like North Dakota and Texas. Since the benchmark year of 2008, a year when the price of oil plummeted from a record high of nearly $150 a barrel to just $30, the U.S. has added 4 million barrels of crude oil per day to the market. This is a remarkable figure when placed alongside the total global output of 75 million barrels per day. Even more impressively, from being heavily dependent on imported oil, the United States has become the world's #1 producer of oil and natural gas. Its total output of oil and gas surpassed Russia's in 2012 and Saudi Arabia's in 2013 for many consecutive years now. The United States has been the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas. Part 5: Oil and the restoration of Russia's superpower status. At the end of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Russian Federation inherited its legacy, and Boris Yeltsin became the first president of modern Russia. He was a historical witness to the disastrous decline of the post-Soviet era. Russia's GDP shrank year after year, and by 1998, the country had defaulted on its debt. Russia's international standing had plummeted. Yeltsin resigned on the very last day of the second millennium. Prime Minister Vladimir Putin became president. Yeltsin was known for his pro-Western views. Putin was the opposite. 1 year after taking office, Putin changed the Russian national anthem. He reinstated the melody of the Soviet national anthem, a clear signal of his ambition to restore Russia's superpower status. Putin's first 8 years in power saw Russia's GDP increase 6-fold. This miraculous growth was inextricably linked to the meteoric rise in global oil prices in the 21st century. Oil and gas accounted for over 60% of Russia's export value and contributed nearly 40% to its GDP. Oil also helped Russia impose its political influence on Europe. It supplied up to 50% of the energy needs of the old continent through a dense network of pipelines. In some Eastern and Central European countries, the supply of oil and gas from Russia was as high as 100%. It was estimated that if Russia were to cut off its gas supply, many European countries, like Italy and Germany, would only be able to be energy self-sufficient for about 2 weeks before facing a state of emergency. Under Putin, Russia has not hesitated to use this energy monopoly to deliver powerful messages on the geopolitical chessboard. The pipelines and Putin's firm hand helped Russia restore its status and served as a launchpad to expand its geopolitical influence. It maintained its permanent seat with veto power on the United Nations Security Council and enhanced its cultural and sporting influence by hosting the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics and the 2018 FIFA World Cup. The superpower that Putin has been building for Russia is precisely an energy superpower. However, Russia's pipeline politics is not without its weaknesses. The pipelines require high installation and maintenance costs and need a profitability timeline of over 20 years. Moreover, they are vulnerable to becoming terrorist targets as they pass through politically and socially unstable regions. In addition, the technology for liquefying natural gas, which allows for the safe transportation of gas by road and sea without relying on pipelines, is opening up future opportunities for LNG suppliers from the United States and countries like Brazil and Mexico. Part 6. Internal conflict within OPEC. From a peak of controlling 60% of the world's crude oil production. By 2014, OPEC had lost a third of its market share, holding only 40%. As its position weakened, internal conflicts began to arise among its member countries. At a meeting in Vienna in November 2014, at a time when oil prices had fallen sharply from over $100 a barrel earlier in the year to just $50, a rift appeared. Some countries, like Venezuela and Iran, wanted to cut production to push prices back up. Saudi Arabia, however, wanted to maintain production levels. They feared a repeat of the 1980s, when cutting production failed to stop the slide in oil prices. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia hoped that a period of low oil prices would pressure private American shale oil companies to cut their own production. This, they reasoned, would eventually cause prices to rise again, without OPEC having to cut its own output. The conflict in views between OPEC's two leading exporters, Saudi Arabia and Iran, had actually been simmering for a long time due to a deep-seated historical animosity between Sunni and Shia Muslims. It all began in the year 632 after the founder of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, passed away without appointing a successor. The dispute over succession split the Muslim community into two factions. The Sunnis supported Abu Bakr, an advisor and the Prophet's father-in-law. Aqiyas supported Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law. Both Abu Bakr and later Ali and his son were assassinated just months after becoming leaders. The two sects began to diverge sharply. Sunnis have often accused Shias of heresy due to the Shia belief that their leaders are divine manifestations. Shias, in turn, have accused the rigid dogma of Sunniism, of giving rise to extremist and terrorist sects. Sunnis make up the majority of the Muslim community, about 80%, and are also the majority in the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia seen as the community's leader. Meanwhile, after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Shias came to power there and have consistently tried to expand their influence in the Middle East. The conflict between these two nations, the most powerful in the region in terms of economy, military, and political influence, which was already simmering, became even more intense due to their disagreements over oil production levels. Part 7. The stories of Venezuela and Nigeria. Oil has brought prosperity and influence to countries with abundant reserves, like those in the Middle East, Russia, and the United States. But it is not a guaranteed ticket to success. Consider Venezuela, the country with the world's largest proven oil reserves. 95% of its export revenue comes from oil. The peak oil prices in the early 21st century blinded the country's leaders to the vulnerability of an economy that relied solely on oil. When oil prices collapsed, Venezuela's economy quickly followed. Hyperinflation ran into the tens of thousands of %. Cash became worthless. Goods disappeared from shelves. The landscape of Venezuela was one of devastation. Nigeria, the country with the world's 10th largest oil reserves, is a different story. During the period of rapid oil price growth in the 1970s, Nigeria borrowed enormous sums of money to build its oil extraction infrastructure. But after the 1980s, when oil prices hit record lows, Nigeria struggled with debt and interest payments. Today, Nigeria has managed to restructure some of its debt, but its economy remains heavily dependent on oil exports and is extremely sensitive to market fluctuations. It is no exaggeration to say that energy sources have turned the wheels of modern history. And for over a century now, oil and gas have held the throne as the kings of energy. In times of war, oil has bestowed the crown of victory upon those who controlled it. It has forged treaties and military alliances based entirely on oil interests. It has determined the potential and, to some extent, the economic growth of nations, perhaps throughout human history. No single physical substance has had such a direct and profound impact on so many international events. And perhaps, for a very long time to come, no other commodity will be able to replace that influence. History always leaves us with lessons. After more than a century of oil, a truth has been established. Whoever controls the energy controls the world. If you enjoyed this story, please like and share to support us. Do not forget to click the subscribe button and the bell icon next to it so you do not miss other content we release in the future. Thank you for listening. This is Thanh Labs.